Hemodynamic. Okay, so that word there, we can break it into two. Okay? So it says hem, which is blood, dynamic, which is motion. Okay, so hemodynamic is blood in motion. Okay? We create blood pressure because blood is in motion. Blood is constantly moving around the blood vessels. That's how you create blood pressure. Okay? So hemodynamic is nothing but the study of blood pressures inside the heart. Okay, the study of blood pressures inside the heart. Learning objectives. After this lecture, you will be able to define hemodynamic, which you've already done. It is the study of blood pressures, blood in motion. You create blood pressure because blood is in motion. Understand how blood flows around the body. Understand 3 factors that affect blood pressure. Understand normal values for hemodynamic pressures. Understand the pressure used to monitor each chamber of the heart. Calculate cardiac output. Okay, so hemodynamic focuses on 2 life functions. Now remember, there are 4 of them altogether. We have ventilation, oxygenation, circulation, and perfusion. So up till now, we've been talking about ventilation and oxygenation. But now hemodynamic focuses on circulation and perfusion, okay? Because the blood has to circulate around before it can get into the cells, okay, or tissues, okay? The 4 life functions must be working every time, okay, all together for somebody to stay alive, okay? Because you can't say, well, I'm breathing in fine, so I don't want my blood to move around. You can't do that, okay? Or maybe my blood is moving around, but I don't need the oxygen. Okay, so anytime any of the life functions is being threatened, you need to react to it. If they're not ventilating, you have to do something about it. If they're not oxygenating, you have to do something about it. If they're not circulating the blood, cardiac output, you got to do something about it. We do CPR. If the patient's not perfusing, you got to do something about it. So if you think about it, how the 4 of them work together is that you breathe in, okay, you get in the oxygen into your lungs. And then you blow up CO2. That's ventilation. That's the first thing. That's where it starts. And then the next thing is oxygenation. That oxygen that is now inside your lungs has to cross over into the blood. Okay, so the crossing over of oxygen from the lungs into the blood is what we call oxygenation. And then you have the oxygen in there now. The oxygen will attach to the hemoglobin. Okay? And then hemoglobin will transport, the hemoglobin is in the blood, transport the oxygen down to the tissues. So you have your circulation and then you have your perfusion. So every one of them has to be working at all times. Okay? If one of them is not working, then you dig a hole and bury people. You dig a hole and bury people. Okay? All right, so circulation and perfusion. Circulation and perfusion occur due to blood pressure, okay, due to blood pressure. What is blood pressure? Okay, it is the pressure created inside the blood vessel as blood flows through it, okay? You have your blood vessel right there, and then you have blood flowing in it. So it impacts the wall of the blood vessel. That's what creates the pressure. So right off, if you're thinking about it, if you don't have enough fluid going through the blood vessel or blood, you're going to have low blood pressure. If you have more fluid going through it, you have more blood pressure because that fluid is going to have to push on the wall of the blood vessel. Okay? So volume is one of the things that determines your blood pressure. If you are dehydrated, for instance, you're going to have low blood pressure because you don't have enough volume to create the pressure. Okay, so 3 factors that control the blood pressure. The first one and the most important one is the heart. The heart is the pump. If your heart quits, that's it. Okay, so you gotta have your heart working. That's what pumps out the blood to go into the blood vessels. Okay? So now, we have medications that can influence the action of the pump. If we want the heart to pump stronger, to move more blood out so that we can have higher blood pressure, then we can give a drug like inotropic agent, like the digoxin. It increases the strength of myocardial contractions. If we want the heart to beat faster, we have drugs that can do that. We'll give, like atropine can do it. So we can influence the action of the pump. If we want the heart to beat slower, we can give a beta blocker, like Indorol, and that will slow it down. Okay? But you gotta have your heart working well for you to have good blood pressure. Any questions about the pump? The next factor that affects blood pressure is the blood itself, the blood volume. Your heart can be working very well. There's nothing wrong with your heart. It's pumping strong enough, it's beating fast enough. But if you don't have the volume, your blood pressure will be low. Because what you need is the volume to go through the blood vessel and create the pressure. Okay? So again, blood pressure can be increased or decreased by controlling the amount of intravascular volume. Like when somebody comes into the emergency room, they were involved in some kind of trauma and they had been bleeding out, they're gonna have low blood pressure. Once they come into the ER, we're gonna put them on IV fluid. And then we do a lab. If their hemoglobin is low, then we'll give them back red blood cells. But they have to have that volume to maintain their blood pressure. If somebody comes in overloaded with fluid, they have costraggles, they have fluid overloaded, they have what we call hypervolemia, and their blood pressure is very high as a result of that, because the more volume that you have going through here, the higher the pressure. So to reduce the blood pressure, what we can do is to diurese the patient. We diurese the patient. All right? So we have things to do to the blood volume to increase it or decrease it. And the last factor that affects the blood pressure is the blood vessel itself, the blood vessel, the diameter of the blood vessel. Okay? For the same amount of blood volume, if your blood vessels are like this, which we can say that they are constricted for the same amount of blood volume, you're going to have high blood pressure. So the smaller the diameter of the blood vessel, the higher the blood pressure. If your blood vessels are like this, dilated for the same amount of volume, you're gonna have low blood pressure. Okay? So now, when somebody comes into the emergency room and they have high blood pressure because their blood vessels are constricted, to lower that blood pressure, we're gonna give them a medication called a vasodilator. A vasodilator, which will open up the blood vessel and the pressure goes down. On the other hand, if they come in with hypotension and we determine that they are hypotensive because their blood vessels are vasodilated, we'll give them a vasoconstrictor, something that can constrict the blood vessels and increase their blood pressure. So, these are the three factors that affect blood pressure, okay? And then it says that changes in hemodynamic monitoring will usually review that one of those three factors mentioned has been altered, which is true. When they come in, if they have low blood pressure, we check on the heart, we check on the volume, we check on their vessels, okay? And then we fix, whichever that is causing the problem, okay? Treatment is always focused on what is causing the problem. If it is the vessels, we can dilate them or we can constrict them. If it is the blood, we can give them more fluid or we can dilute the patient. If it is the heart, well, we can make the heart pump stronger or faster, or we can make it to pump slower. So we can control all of those things. High blood pressure. Now, by definition, what is a good blood pressure is (120 over 80). But everybody cannot be 120 over 80. That's like an average of what everybody is supposed to be, 120 over 80. But the range is usually about, I think it's 100 over 60 to 140 over 90. That's a normal range. So if you're in that range, you are okay, really. But hypertension, which is high blood pressure, is when the systolic pressure is greater than 140 or the diastolic pressure is greater than 90. That's called hypertension. Now, hypertension will kill you very slowly because a lot of people will go around for so many years and don't even know that they have high blood pressure. So that's why we call it the silent killer. It's a silent killer. One day it's gonna sneak in and get you, you have a headache, you don't feel well, you're always tired, but you don't know what the problem is unless you go to the doctor and then they check your blood pressure and they say, oh yeah, it's high. We'll come back, we'll check it again. So you check it several times and then they make diagnosis of high blood pressure, okay? And then low blood pressure, by definition, is when the systolic pressure is less than 100 or when the diastolic pressure is less than 60. Now, low blood pressure is very quickly and very easily diagnosed. And if somebody was having low blood pressure now, we will know it because they will be on the floor, they will have syncope, they will have shortness of breath, they will have hypoxemia. So low blood pressure kills you quicker than high blood pressure. So If you're low, you go fast, and if you're high, you can go slow. Okay? Any questions about that? So now, these are all the hemodynamic pressures that we're going to be talking about. Okay? There is a catheter that we're going to talk about down the line, catheter. It's called the Swan-Ganz catheter. Okay? Usually, they put it in on the right side of the chest. It goes to a major vein like subclavian vein or internal or external jugular vein. They put it there, and then it goes through the right atrium, goes through the tricuspid valve, goes into the right ventricle, goes through the pulmonic valve, and then ends up in the pulmonary artery. So if you want to, you can call it pulmonary artery catheter, okay, because that's where it lodges. So anytime we want to measure hemodynamic pressures, somebody is very sick, and we want to monitor all their blood pressure, we're going to put in a Swan-Ganz catheter. Okay? So these are all the pressures that you'll be able to monitor or calculate as a result of putting in the Swan-Ganz catheter. CVP, central venous pressure. Yeah, we can monitor that. RAP, right atrial pressure, pressure in the right atrium. You can monitor that because the catheter goes through there. PAP pressure, pulmonary artery pressure. Yeah, it's inside the lungs, inside the pulmonary artery, so we can monitor the pressure there. We'll figure out what the pressure there is. We can monitor the waist pressure, where the catheter doesn't go all the way to the left side, but there is a way to measure the pressure on the left side, and I'll show you once we get there. We can shoot for cardiac output. We can calculate the stroke volume, PVO, SVO, right ventricular stroke walk index, left ventricular stroke walk index, cardiac index, and stroke volume index. So these are the pressures that we'll be talking about. Okay? So let's start with CVP. Now, CVP stands for central venous pressure. Central venous pressure. It is the amount of pressure inside the great veins. We'll call this here the inferior and the superior vena cava. We'll call them great veins because they are big veins. All these smaller veins in the lower portion of the body usually would dump their blood into the inferior vena cava. All the smaller veins in the upper portion of the body would dump their blood into the superior vena cava. And then the blood ends up in the right atrium. So it's coming from here, it's coming from here. So as blood is returning to the right atrium, what is the amount of pressure here? The pressure. That's what we call central venous pressure. Normal for that pressure is 2 to 6 millimeters of mercury. That's the amount of pressure that will be in there. Remember when we were talking about mechanical ventilation, we said that positive pressure ventilation increases CVP. Okay? So when that pressure is greater than 6, it makes it very difficult for blood to return to the right heart. Because it's like pressure gradient like now. For fluid to go from point A to point B, the pressure here must be greater than the pressure here. For instance, if I have 20 here, and I have 5 here, my gradient or my drive to move will be 15. Okay, so that's what's going on. Now, blood is coming back here, okay, that's being all over the body. The tissues use up all the oxygen, and then we have deoxygenated blood returning. Okay, the pressure coming from here is bigger than 2 to 6. Okay, we'll go over that. You have more pressure when the blood is returning here. So now, all of a sudden now, if this is greater than 6, it will be very close to the amount of pressure here. So it makes it very difficult for the blood to return. So in that case, you will have, so if I have 15 here, my gradient is only 5. So there is decreased drive to return. There's decreased venous return. That's what mechanical ventilation does. Because mechanical ventilation, the more PEEP you add, or the more pressure that you have, will squeeze the great veins. It will squeeze it, and the pressure in there goes up. So it makes it very difficult for blood to return to the right heart. Okay? Any questions about that? So, because the CVP is on the right side of the heart, we use it to monitor the function of the right heart. Anytime CVP is very high or very low, something is wrong with the right heart. Okay? So, on the test, if they say, well, how would you monitor? Anything right is fine. How would you monitor the right heart filling pressure, CVP? Right. The key word there is right. How would you monitor right heart preload, CVP? How would you monitor right ventricular end diastolic pressure? The key word is right, CVP. So everything on the right is CVP. CVP is everything on the right. Any questions about that? So that's what we use CVP for. Sometimes the unit can be in centimeter of water. Okay? So it would be 2 to 6 millimeter of mercury, or approximately 4 to 12 centimeter of water. So you got to be very careful on the exam. You know, read the unit very well and know what they're asking you, because if they say 4 to 12 centimeter of water, that would be normal CVP. Okay, there is, it goes like 1 millimeter of mercury equals 1.36 centimeter of water. So if I want to convert 2 millimeter of mercury to centimeter of water, I'll multiply by 1.36. It's not, it's approximate, it's an approximate number. Comes out to be maybe like 3 point something. Okay? Any questions about the CVP now before we move on? So you know where the CVP is, right here, and the pressure inside here. All right, so the next pressure that we're going to talk about is RAP, right atrial pressure. Right atrial pressure. It is right here, the pressure inside the right atrium. Right here. Now, that pressure can also be used to monitor the function of the right heart because it's on the right side. So if I have a question about my right heart and my CVP is not given, I can look at my right atrial pressure. Okay? So if you ask me, well, how would you monitor the right heart function? I say, well, right atrial pressure if I don't have CVP. How would you monitor the right heart filling pressure? Well, right atrial pressure, if you don't give me CVP, they are exactly the same pressure. in value as well, because right atrial pressure is 2 to 6 millimeters of mercury. And I'll tell you why, okay? So this is what is going on. Blood is coming from here, coming from there, going into the right atrium. Okay? So this here fills up with blood. There is no valve here. There's no valve here. Okay? So once this chamber fills up with blood, the valve closes. Before contraction starts, before contraction of the ventricle, the pressure in here is equal to the pressure out here. So it's like blood is coming and it fills up, there's nowhere else to go. So the pressure out here is equal to the pressure in here. That's why they're equal before contraction. Okay? And then we go to the PAP pressure, pulmonary artery pressure, pulmonary artery pressure. Pressure inside the lungs or the pulmonary artery, in the pulmonary system, if you want to say that. Okay? So we're talking about the pressure in here, all the way in the pulmonary system coming back. Okay? Because if you have high pressure in the lungs, for some reason, it's going to back up here anyway. It backs up inside the pulmonary artery. Okay? If you have high pressure here, eventually it goes out there to the pulmonary system, to the lungs. So PAP is the pulmonary system. Okay? So this is the pulmonary blood pressure. The 120 over 20, 120 over 80 is the systemic blood pressure. That's the one that everybody knows. That's the one, and I don't blame them because that's the most important one. That's the one that is going to kick out oxygenated blood to organs and tissues. Okay, but we have 3 other blood pressures in the heart other than that one, and this is one of them, 25 over 10. You only have heard about pulmonary hypertension. Pulmonary hypertension. When you have pulmonary hypertension, what that means is that this pressure is greater than 25 over 10. Because either you have it greater than 25 or you have it greater than, the bottom number greater than 10. That would be pulmonary hypertension. Okay? So what I'm saying here is that if anything is going wrong inside the pulmonary system, it will be reflected in that pressure. For instance, pulmonary embolism. You say pulmonary embolism, that pressure will go up. Okay, because now pulmonary embolism causes you not to have enough oxygen. If you don't have enough oxygen inside your pulmonary system, the pulmonary vessels will begin to constrict. And when they constrict, you have increase in pressure, which then backs all the way up into the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary edema, that pressure will change. It will go up. Pulmonary hypertension, that pressure goes up. Pulmonary congestion, anything pulmonary will cause that pressure to go up. We know immediately. Any questions about that? Does anybody know how we get the bottom number of the blood pressure? Because you see the 25, the top number, systolic pressure, is like here when the right ventricle is contracting. When this valve closes, there is what we call an isometric contraction. The blood is being squeezed inwards like that. The pressure goes up. That's the top number. That's the pressure there. Okay. When the right ventricle is contracting. Okay. So when that pressure reaches 25, this valve here opens up. Pulmonary valve opens up. Okay. And then the blood rushes out into the pulmonary artery going towards the lungs. So what's happening then is that as the blood is moving forward into the pulmonary system, the pressure behind the blood drops. Okay, it's like when you pour water, like that, you pour a cup of water. In front, the water is racing, and then behind it is slowing down. So as the blood is flowing towards the lungs, the pressure behind the blood decreases until the pressure decreases to below the pressure in here. If that happens, then this valve will close. When this valve closes, whatever pressure that you have in here will be your diastolic pressure. And then what influences the pressure? Well, the amount of volume that didn't get pumped out is what is going to determine your diastolic pressure. Because you use volume to build pressure. So if my right heart is weak and I pump out the blood, well, I didn't pump out all that it got filled up with. So at the beginning of diastole, my diastolic pressure will be high because I have a lot of volume sitting here. If you pump out most of it, well, your diastolic pressure will be lower because you don't have enough volume to build pressure in there. The same thing on the left side. The left ventricle pumps blood out through the aorta, through the aortic valve. It goes into the aorta. So as this oxygenated blood now is going to the systemic system, the pressure drops behind it. And then the aortic valve closes, and then whatever pressure in here after this here has closed is your diastolic pressure, which is usually 80. So that's the way it works. Okay? So let's keep on going here. Just know that for pulmonary arterial pressure, you are monitoring the lung or the pulmonary system. Any condition inside the pulmonary system will affect that blood pressure. If I have tumor here, that will be resistance as obstruction. That will cause the pressure to go up. If I have tumor inside my lungs, well, that's resistance too. That will cause the pressure here to go up in the pulmonary system. Okay? All right, so now, the next one is what we call the wedge pressure. Pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. Or sometimes they call it the pulmonary wedge pressure. So now, this is the pressure that is measured as blood, oxygenated blood is returning from the lungs towards the left side of the heart. So they're moving from the pulmonary vein into the left atrium. We measure that pressure. So because it is the pressure measured as blood is returning to the left side of the heart, we use it to monitor the function of the left heart. If anything is going wrong inside the left heart, it will affect the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. So again, how would you monitor the left heart filling pressure, wedge pressure? How would you monitor the left heart preload, wedge, everything, anything left? Anything left is wedge, wedge is anything left. Now, let me give you an example. A patient has just returned in the ICU because they had mitral valve replacement done. Where is the mitral valve? On the left side, right? Bicuspid valve. I'll show you that in a minute. They had mitral valve replacement, and now they're back in the ICU. Which of the following hemodynamic pressures will be very or much important to monitor? Will be the wedge pressure, because the mitral valve is on the left side. Okay? Mechanical ventilation with PEEP, that affects your wedge pressure, because now remember, mechanical ventilation decreases cardiac output. Why? Because it's the left heart not to pump out enough blood. CHF is on the left side, congestive heart failure. And it just means that your heart is very weak. It's not able to pump out a whole lot of blood. So you have a lot of blood sitting here that is not being pumped out. And the pressure goes up. Okay? So, the people that have CHF that are not receiving any treatment will always have low blood pressure because their heart is very weak. It's not pumping out enough cardiac outputs. Any questions about pulmonary capillary waist pressure? So again, CVP is right here, the pressure in here, PAP is in here, and then the waist pressure is there, the pressure in here, the pulmonary vein heading to when blood is heading towards the left side. Okay? Down the line, I will tell you how we measure the waist pressure because that pulmonary arterial catheter that I talked about will go through here and stop right here. Okay, it doesn't go to the left side. But what happens, actually, let me explain it to you. What happens is that catheter has like a balloon at the tip of it. So it's like this, and then it has a balloon like that. It has something that we can use to inflate it. So now what we're doing now is, anytime we want to measure the pressure on the left side, the pulmonary capillary waist pressure, the catheter is in here. So what we're going to do is that we're going to put some air inside the balloon and inflate it. So once you inflate the balloon, you're going to block the blood coming behind it. Like what is coming from here will block it because this is up. So because you're blocking the blood now, the pressure that is measured is the pressure that is coming from this side in front of the balloon. Okay? That's how we get our waist pressure. And that's with that Swan-Ganz catheter. Okay? Cardiac output. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped out from the ventricle in 1 minute. So your heart has beat for 1 minute. You measure the volume that it pumped out in 1 minute. Normally, the right ventricular output and the left ventricular output are equal. Whatever amount of blood that you pump out from the right side and what you pump out to the left side are equal. Okay? If you return like 5 liters of blood to the right heart, that same 5 liters of blood will be the blood that will go through the right atrium, to the right ventricle, to the pulmonary artery, and get to the left side. And both of them contract at the same time. When the right heart is contracted, the left heart is contracted. The right heart contracts and pumps blood towards the lungs. The left heart pumps blood to the body. Okay? So, 4 to 8 liters per minute. There is a mathematical relationship between cardiac output, stroke volume, and heart rate. Now, stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out in 1 beat. Boom, your heart beats. How much volume did you get out? That's your stroke volume. And then, of course, your heart rate is the amount of times that your heart beat in 1 minute. So now, so if you look at this formula here, it means that there are 2 ways that somebody can actually increase your cardiac output. Anytime your cardiac output goes up, your blood pressure goes up. Anytime your cardiac output goes down, your blood pressure goes down. So now, it's either that my heart is beating very fast, or maybe you're just pumping out enough volume per beat. That's what will get this here to stay normal. Now, assuming that I'm dehydrated, okay, I don't have enough intravascular volume. For my body to maintain good cardiac output, my heart rate has to go up. So people who are dehydrated will always have tachycardia. If I'm volume overloaded, well, my heart rate doesn't have to be very fast because I got the volume to get my cardiac output. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go further down in the lecture. So now we have cardiac index. Cardiac index. Now, cardiac index, well, now let me give you a normal stroke volume. Normal stroke volume is 60 to 130 milliliter. 60 to 130 milliliter is normal stroke volume. Okay, if your chamber can pump out anywhere between 60 to 130 milliliter, you have normal cardiac function. And of course, normal heart rate is 60 to 100. Now, cardiac index is a way of individualizing cardiac output. For instance, I'm bigger than Kiera. Okay, let's say Kiera's cardiac output is 5. My cardiac output is 5. Well, it's normal cardiac output for me and her, but the question is, since I'm bigger, is that 5 liters per minute enough for me? Because it's supposed to be that the more body mass that you have, the more cardiac output that you're going to have. So even though I have it at 5, which is normal, well, is that normal for me, really? Is that what I need? So what we're gonna do to find out whether that 5 liter is good for me is we are going to divide it by my body surface area. So that's what's called cardiac index. You are individualizing cardiac output. So if you divide your cardiac output by your body surface area, and it falls between 2 to 4, then that would be good. That would be a good cardiac output for. Okay? So another thing that I want you to know is that here's the formula for cardiac index. Cardiac output divided by body surface area. So that means then that if cardiac output is going up, cardiac index is going up. If cardiac output is going down, cardiac index is going down. For instance, they may say on a mechanical ventilation question that a respiratory therapist increased PEEP from 10 to 15. The cardiac index is now 1.5. Well, that's another way of telling you that cardiac output has just dropped. So the right thing to do is you back up on your PEEP. If you had your PEEP on 12, you can say, well, 12 did not work. How about 11? Would that cause a problem? Well, 11 is causing problem. How about 10? And so you back up on your PEEP. Okay? I have an example here. It says cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate, and here is a patient has a stroke volume of 100 milliliter and a heart rate of 60 per minute. Calculate cardiac output. All you have to do is you multiply your stroke volume by your heart rate, and then you divide by 1,000. So that would be 6 liters per minute, which would be a normal cardiac output. A patient has a cardiac output of 8 liters per minute and a heart rate of 60 per minute. Calculate the stroke volume. The same formula, you just have to rearrange the formula a little bit. So stroke volume is cardiac output divided by heart rate. If you want to, you can see or look at stroke volume as the volume on the mechanical ventilation. And then your cardiac output will be your minute volume, and your heart rate is your respiratory rate. They work the same way. Okay? So what we're gonna do here, we're gonna convert the cardiac output to milliliter because the answer for the stroke volume is gonna come out in milliliter. And then we divide by the heart rate, which will be 100 here. And then here's another one here. The patient has a stroke volume of 100 and cardiac output of 7. Calculate the heart rate. Okay, then you rearrange the formula. You are going to divide the cardiac output by stroke volume, and then that will give you a heart rate of 70. Can everybody do this? I think so. Very easy. Here's stroke volume. The amount of blood pumped out in 1 beat. 60 to 140 milliliter. I want to do this again. Cardiac output equals stroke volume and heart rate. The higher the stroke volume, the higher the cardiac output. Now let me ask you, if somebody is bleeding out, would they have high or low stroke volume? If somebody has been bleeding out blood, low stroke volume. So that means then that their blood pressure will be low if their heart doesn't start beating very fast. Okay? The higher the heart rate, the higher the cardiac output, the higher the blood pressure. Now, albuterol, for instance, albuterol can raise your heart. It can cause you to have tachycardia. Therefore, increase your cardiac output, therefore, increase your blood pressure. That's why one of the complications or side effects of albuterol is hypertension. Albuterol causes hypertension by raising your heart. All right, so the next thing now is stroke volume index. Anytime you index something, it means that you're dividing by the body surface area. Okay, you want to individualize that value to somebody. Okay? So now, if we want to calculate stroke volume index, we take our stroke volume and then we divide it by the body surface area of that person. Okay, so again, somebody may have stroke volume of 60, which is normal, but it may not be enough for their body. They may be a bigger person. They may need like 100 or 110 or whatever. Okay, that's why we want to individualize that. Okay, let me do this and then we'll take a break. The first one there is right ventricular stroke work. Right ventricular stroke work. That is measuring how well the right heart, the right ventricle is pumping, like that. Like that. That's all it means. Right ventricular stroke work. How good the right heart is pumping. Okay, because if your right heart is good, your right ventricle is good, it will be strong and move blood towards the pulmonary system. So we can calculate that. So what we do then is, since on the right side, we're going to take our stroke volume, okay? We'll multiply it by the difference between our mean pulmonary pressure and the CVP. We're going to work all of that out down the line. And then we'll multiply it by 1.36. We'll multiply it by 0.0136. Now, that is a constant. It's always going to be there. That 0.0136 is a constant. And it is there to convert the entire unit to this unit here, gram meter square, gram meter, okay? Gram meter. Because you know, this is in This is a milliliter. This one here is millimeter of mercury. That's millimeter of mercury. So we want to make it 1 unit. So we multiply by 0.0136. So we can convert all of those units to a unit called a gram meter. Okay? Any questions about that? So now, I didn't give you normal value for that, but there is a formula. Let me teach you this formula. There's a formula that says normal plus normal equals normal, right? That sounds very stupid, right? But it's true. Normal plus normal equals normal. Well, if you ask me, well, what's normal right ventricular stroke work? I say, well, hold on a minute. What's normal stroke volume? Well, I'll put it there. What's normal mean arterial pressure? Well, I'll put normal there. What's normal CVP? Well, I'll put it there, and then I multiply. So if everything is here is normal, well, this gotta be normal. So normal plus normal equals normal. Okay, so it kind of varies a little bit from individual to individual, depending on what your stroke volume is, your MPAP is, your CVP is. Okay? And then the next one now is right ventricular stroke work index. Remember, indexing means dividing by the body surface area. So we want to see how well that number will work for a particular individual. So we're going to divide by the body surface area. Okay, so the unit comes out to gram meter squared. Okay? Because the body surface area is measured in meter squared. Okay? The next one is left ventricular stroke work. Well, how well the left ventricle is stroking, pumping, like that. Is it weak? Or is it lighter? Okay? So the way we calculate that is we take our stroke volume and then we multiply by the difference between our mean arterial pressure. Mean arterial pressure is on the left side. MPAP is on the right side. The waist pressure is on the left side. CVP is on the right side. And so we take away our waist pressure from the mean arterial pressure. And then again we multiply by 0.0136. Normal plus normal equals normal. And if you ask me what's normal left ventricular stroke work, and I go, well, just hold on. What's normal stroke volume? 60 to 130. Well, I'll pick a number there. What's normal MPAP? Well, 80 to 100. I'll pick a number. Okay. What's normal waist pressure? 4 to 12. Well, I'll pick a number there. I'll multiply it out. Whatever number I get will be normal value. That's very easy, right? Yeah, because they do that on the exam. What's this? Let's say now, let me just say that, let's just assume that normal left ventricular stroke work, let's just say that it's 30, 20 to 30. I'm just assuming. Now, they say, well, calculate left ventricular stroke work. And then they will give you normal stroke volume. And then they will give you normal mean arterial pressure. And then they will give you normal wage pressure. If you get enough census, all you got to do is you pick a number between 20 and 30. And you're done. Because it's going to come out that way. That's what we call the shortcut. And they do that on the exam. So anytime they tell you to calculate something, inspect the values, because you can make it easy for yourself, you know. Inspect the values. If all the values are normal, you pick a normal value. If all the values are abnormal, you pick an abnormal value. Like now, if the stroke volume was like 40, Okay. This one here is 12. This is 3. Well, there's no way I'm going to be in this range. There's no way. Even if, Jesus Christ came down, it wouldn't be possible. So I have to look for a number lower than that. And you move on. But now if you want to calculate, that's okay too, but it's going to cost you more time. Okay? All right, so from today moving forward, when you're taking your practice test and you have to calculate something, please inspect the values. You will see what I'm telling you. That's all they're doing. But they know that you don't have time for that, to do fractions and things like that. They just want to know, look, the intent of the MBRC is not to have you calculate. That's not what they're doing. They just want to know whether you know what you're doing. Okay, look at this one here. CaO2 equals hemoglobin times 1.34 times SaO2 plus PaO2 times 0.003. And then they go, well, calculate the arterial oxygen content. Well, hemoglobin 15, is that normal? That's normal hemoglobin because 14 to 16. SaO2, 95%. That's normal oxygen saturation. PaO2, 85. That's normal. And then they give you choices here. They go like, what's normal range for this? Does anybody remember? 17 to 20, right? 17 to 20. They go, well, 5, 8, 10, and then 18. Which one would you pick?
18.
I'll just pick 18. Because look, everything is normal here. Well, this is abnormal. It's not, it's below 17. That's below 17, that's below 17. So it cannot be any of this two here. It has to be this one here. Well, if I'm giving bad hemoglobin, bad O2 saturation, bad PaO2, well, it cannot be 18. In that case, they may go like 20, 19, 18. So you have to pick 10 because 10 is abnormal. Okay? All these little tricks, they're going to teach you that too when they come out here. Okay, now let's do an example. A patient that assured the following: MPAP is 20, CVP is 5, stroke volume is 60, body surface area is 2 meters squared. Calculate right ventricular stroke walk and right ventricular stroke walk index. So write down the formula, always write down the formula. So we're going to do 60 times 20 minus 5 times 0.0136. So that comes out to be 12.24 gram meter. And then index, meaning that we're just going to divide with the body surface area. So when you index, you have about half of that. So 6.12 gram meter squared. Here's one for the left, the same way. Okay? You plug in the values, you plug in your stroke volume, your mean arterial pressure, your waist pressure, and you multiply by 0.0136. Now, usually the left side is bigger than the right side. The left part does more work, okay? And then you index it. Review. What is normal CVP?
2 to 6.
Hmm?
2 to 6.
2 to 6, right? 2 to 6 millimeter of mercury or 4 to 12 centimeter of water. What side of the heart is pulmonary capillary wedge pressure used to monitor? The left side. Any problem on the left is wedge pressure. Wedge pressure is any problem on the left. What is normal cardiac output? 48 liters per minute, very good. What is the PAP pressure used to monitor? The pulmonary system, the lungs and the pulmonary artery. Name 3 factors that control blood pressure. We have the pump, which is the heart, that's the most important. We have the blood volume, and then we have the blood vessels. Those 3 things. Well, if you haven't high blood pressure or low blood pressure, it has to be one of those 3. Something's wrong with one of those. What is stroke volume?
The amount of blood in one beat.
Yeah. The amount of blood pumped out in 1 beat is your stroke volume. The amount of blood pumped out in 1 minute is your cardiac output. All right, so we're going to take a break, and then we're going to have a review of the cardiovascular system. Do you want to come back 10 minutes still? Is that too long?
A little bit.
Okay. How long do you want to be done? I'll let you make the decision because.
Maybe 10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. All right, we can do 10 minutes, yeah. Yeah, so let's come back, let's have a review of the cardiovascular system. Okay. Now, what you have to understand is that cells make up tissues. Tissues make up organs. Organs make up systems. So when we talk about the cardiovascular system, we're talking about everything, okay, that will enable the heart to function well. Okay, it's a system. So these are the components of the cardiovascular system. You have your heart, the pump itself. You have the artery, you have the capillary, you have the vein, and then you have the blood. Okay, so here, an artery is a blood vessel that carries blood away from the heart. I may have to, I'll probably have that down here. Yeah, I have it. So let me start from here. Let's go over the heart first. So, again, we have one heart, but actually we have 2. Okay, because we have the right and the left heart. Anatomically, they are right next to each other, but physiologically, they are different. Each one of them does a different type of work. All that the right heart does is to pump blood to the lungs. And then if you look at it, the lungs are right next door. So boom, they're done. The blood is there. Okay? So it doesn't do a whole lot of work. That's how come that over 80% of the heart attack occur on the left side, because the left side does more work than the right heart. Okay? The left heart is more muscular. It pumps blood to everybody else, from your head to the tip of your toes. And then we have arteries. These are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart, regardless of the type of blood in it. Okay? If a blood vessel carries blood away from the heart, it's an artery. The reason we say that is that we have the pulmonary artery. But the pulmonary artery has deoxygenated blood in it. But it is an artery because it carries blood away from the heart. we have the umbilical artery in the baby, if you remember that. The umbilical artery returns blood to the placenta. Okay? And then we have, I thought I had veins in there too. Yeah. Okay, so capillaries are the smallest blood vessels at which gas exchange takes place. The smallest blood vessels. So you have an artery, it will keep on branching into arterioles, okay? And then you have the vein keep on branching until you have the venules. So they kind of like join together, okay? Like kind of like that. Hypercommon, branching like that. So this would be the arterioles, and then you have the vein over here, venous. Okay, the organ is usually in the middle like that. So the artery brings blood, okay, arterial blood, it goes into the organ or the tissue. They use up the arterial blood, and then the carbon dioxide will diffuse away like that through the vein. Or the arterial blood will go that way, okay? So for every organ in the body, you have a vein that takes blood away from it. You have an artery that brings arterial blood to it. Okay? So those will be the capillaries. That's where gas exchange takes place. And then we have veins. A vein is a blood vessel that returns blood to the heart regardless of the type of blood in it. We have the pulmonary vein. The pulmonary vein returns blood to the left atrium, but it's got oxygenated blood in it because it's just blood coming from the lungs. And then we have the umbilical vein that takes blood from the placenta into the baby. Okay? But it is oxygenated blood. Okay, so it's regardless of the type of blood. That's the way we define an artery and a vein. And then we have blood, okay, itself, the liquid portion of the cardiovascular system. Okay, it is the medium in which all blood substances are dissolved. Okay, it is the medium in which all blood substances are dissolved. Like inside the plasma, you have electrolytes dissolved in it. You have blood cells like the red blood cells, the white blood cells, platelets. Okay, you have blood protein. Okay, you have gases. So all of this stuff is dissolved in the blood, the liquid portion of the cardiovascular system. So the heart has 4 chambers. We have the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left atrium, and the left ventricle. 4 chambers in the heart. The heart has 4 circulatory branches. We have the systemic arteries. We have the systemic veins. We have the pulmonary arteries. And then we have actually one pulmonary artery, the pulmonary veins. Each branch, each circulatory branch feeds or is fed by a chamber or a vessel. For instance, the systemic arteries are fed by the left ventricle. When the blood pumps out here, boom, it goes all over the body. It goes into the artery. Here's the right atrium here. Okay? The systemic veins, all these little veins that are going to dump their blood into the blood veins, feeds the atria, the right atria. Okay? And then you have right ventricle over here that feeds the pulmonary artery. And then you have the pulmonary vein, okay, that feeds the left atrium. So each circulatory branch feeds or is being fed by a branch, by a chamber or vessel. Any questions about that? The heart has 4 valves. I think we can see a pattern emerging here. How many chambers? 4. How many circulatory branches? 4. How many valves? 4. So we have the tricuspid valve right here, which separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. We have the bicuspid valve, which separates the left atrium from the left ventricle. And those two together are called atrioventricular valves because they separate the atrium from the ventricle, atrioventricular valves. And by the way, another name for bicuspid valve is mitral valve. So in the exam, if they want to be funny, they call it mitral valve, because everybody knows what bicuspid valve is, mitral valve. And then we have another two. We have the aortic valve, which is right there, that separates the left ventricle from the aorta. And then we have the pulmonic valve, which separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary artery. And then together, they are called the semilunar valves. Semilunar valves. So a total of 4 valves. And make no mistake about that, how many blood pressures are in the heart? 4 blood pressures. We only know about 1, okay? We talk about the 120/80 all the time. That's the systemic blood pressure. And the reason that we talk about it all the time is because it's very important. Okay, your tissues and organs have to get oxygenated blood. Otherwise, you're not going to go anywhere. We dig a hole and bury people. And then we have the pulmonary blood pressure, 25/10 on the right side, 25/10. And then we have a pressure inside the left ventricle when the left ventricle is contracting. Before we get our bottom number, before we get the 80. So when that valve is closed, contraction is going on, the pressure generated inside the left ventricle is 120/0. 120/0. And then on the right side, when the right ventricle is contracting, the pressure generated in there is 25/0. So these are the 4 blood pressures in the heart. Okay, so this one here is showing the layers of the heart. But particularly, I want you to know the myocardium and the endocardium. The endocardium is the innermost layer of the heart. The innermost layer of the heart. That is the layer that gives rise to most of the internal structures of the heart, the valves and other things, you know. And then, of course, the myocardium is the muscle around the heart. That's the one that we want to protect most of the time. If something goes wrong with it, then you have a heart attack. The muscle must have adequate oxygenated blood. Okay, so we'll protect the myocardium, and then we'll protect the endocardium, because if you don't, bacteria gets there, you have endocarditis, and then that can mess up a lot of the internal structures of the heart. Okay? And then you have the outermost layer there. You have the pericardium, you have the epicardium. Okay? Because I talked about the endocardium. some more pictures here, the same thing really. But this structure here, this thing here that looks like a football net, okay? Basketball net, I should say. It's called the tendon. That's the thing that pulls on the valve. It helps to pull on the valve, open it up like the tricuspid valve is going to open up. It pulls on it. During contraction, there is a muscle there attached to it, the papillary muscle. Okay. During contraction, the papillary muscles will contract and get that thing to hold the valve right there, so it doesn't open up. So the contraction puts pressure on it to hold the valves. So it's a very important structure inside the heart. Any questions? Now, this is the way that electricity flows around the heart. Before your heart can contract, it must get electrical current coming from the AC node. And the AC node is the primary pacemaker of the heart. You can see where it is. It is located in the upper right quadrant of the right atrium. It generates about 1,600 electrical signals per minute. That's normal heart rate. It just does that. We call that automaticity. The ability of the cardiac muscle cell to spontaneously generate an impulse without external stimulus. So it knows to do it. It knows to discharge 1,600 signals per minute. So now what happens then is when those impulses are discharged at the SA node or from the SA node, they will arrive to the AV node, okay, which is the primary pacemaker of the heart, the secondary pacemaker of the heart. Okay. We call it secondary because if the SA node for some reason is not pacing the heart, the AV node takes over pacing the heart, and it paces the heart at the rate of 40 to 60 signals per minute. So now, those impulses are temporarily held there, and then they continue down the line. They go to the east bundle, and then they go to the branch into two, the right and left bundle branches, and then finally, the electrical signals will arrive at the Purkinje fibers. And so the Purkinje fiber is the final destination of the electrical current. You can see how both of them embrace the ventricles. Okay, it goes like that. So once that electrical current comes down to the ventricles, the ventricular muscles will depolarize. Okay? And then after depolarization, they will contract and then eject the blood out. And then once the blood is out and the valve closes, the pulmonic valve and the aortic valve are closed, then we're into diastole now. During diastole, the chambers will refill up with blood. And then after that, we'll wait for another electrical current to come down from the SA node. So if the electrical current is coming down from any other place other than the SA node, what you get is arrhythmia. That's what arrhythmia is, and no one can beat. However, we have a third pacemaker of the heart, the Purkinje fibers, or you can say the ventricles. Those are the tertiary pacemaker of the heart. If the SA node cannot pace, the AV node cannot pace, all of a sudden the ventricles will begin to pace themselves. Okay, but we don't want that because they can only pace at the rate of 25 to 40. Your heart rate is 25 to 40. That amount of heart rate will not guarantee adequate perfusion to organs and tissues. So usually we start CPR. Okay? You're not supposed to do CPR or chest compression on somebody that has pulse. Okay, but how much what is your pulse? Okay, if it's only 25, that's not enough. You're gonna do CPR anyway, but you're gonna have to squeeze out more blood from your chest. Okay? Now, cardiac cycle. Okay, so you have the heart contracting, we have the contractile phase of the heart. We call that systole. Systole is the contractile phase of the heart, where the blood is ejected out. Diastole is the relaxation phase of the heart, okay, which is where the chambers will fill back up with blood. Okay? So now, if you look at the cardiac cycle then, the first thing that happens, the very first phase of cardiac cycle is arterial filling. Arterial filling. So now, the two atria will fill up with blood. Okay, so on the right side, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava fills up the right atrium with blood. On the left side, the blood coming from the lungs through the pulmonary vein fills up the left atrium. Okay, so as the chambers are being filled up, the pressure inside the chambers increase. Okay, if you remember, you have to use volume to build pressure. Okay, so if you have, or rather you use flow to build pressure, and then you use pressure to build volume. So as more flow of blood is coming in here, the pressure there will begin to rise. And then what you're gonna find out now is that the pressure now in here is greater than the pressure in here, which then forces this valve open. Pressure is what opens up the valve. The same thing on the left side. Blood is coming from the pulmonary vein, filling this up, the pressure there is rising, and then all of a sudden the pressure here is greater than the pressure in here, and the mitral valve will open up. It's supposed to be simultaneous at the same time. Okay, this one is filling up, that one is filling up. And this one here is contracting, that one is contracting. Okay, so now, the blood is in here, the valve opens up on the right side, it goes in here, opens here, it goes in here, okay? And then the third one is isometric contractions. Isometric contractions. So once the ventricles are filled up with blood completely at the end of diastole, meaning that the chambers are completely filled up with blood now, this valve here now will close. That one is already closed, so this one here closes, and that one there closes. Okay? Electrical current comes down from the SA node all the way down to the Purkinje fibers, strikes the muscle, you depolarize the muscle, you have contraction. So on the right hand side, blood now will be ejected into the pulmonary artery towards the lungs, and then on the left side is ejected into the aorta towards the systemic arteries. So that's what happens, you know. So the oxygenated blood is used up. The oxygen in the oxygenated blood is used up, and then the deoxygenated blood returns back. So the thing goes over and over for about 100 years or so, if God is going to let you live that long, right? The heart is designed to beat up to 100 years. But sometimes it doesn't. Yeah, sometimes people die quicker, you know. Yeah, I have an uncle now, you know, he is 102 years old and still moving around. I'm like, man, you gotta tell me what your formula is. Because I want to live that long too. All right. Okay, vascular system. Factors that affect blood flow. Now, what are some of the factors that will affect blood flowing through the vessel? The first one is viscosity of the blood. Now, viscosity is the ease at which blood can flow. Is it thick? Is it thin? Well, if it is thin, well, it will flow very easily. But if it is thick, it will be very hard to flow. And that's a problem. We get a problem when the blood is very thick. If you have congestive heart failure, your heart is very weak. And if your blood is very thick, well, that stresses your heart. It can pump it out. That's how come when you see people that have CHF, they're always on blood thinner. We'll give them blood thinner to thin their blood so that it will be easier for their weak heart to move it. Okay? Length of the vascular bed. That reminds me about the ET tube and the tracheostomy tube. The longer the airway, the more resistance that you have. The shorter the airway, the less resistance that you have. And that's one of the reasons why a doctor can treat a patient that is proving to be very difficult to win if they're intubated. Once you treat them, you decrease resistance and they win faster. Well, now, let's say that the kidneys are over there by the window and the liver is right here. Well, the liver is going to get more perfusion than the kidneys because the resistance for blood to flow to the kidneys is higher. It's way out there. Okay? So the amount of blood that any organ receives depends on how far it is away from the heart. Okay? Any questions about that? The liver is a very vital organ. It's right there, and it gets almost 50% of the cardiac output. I think the kidneys only get like 22% of the cardiac output. Blood vessel diameter, that is true. If you have a constricted blood vessel, it will be very difficult for blood to flow through it to go somewhere. If you have a dilated blood vessel, then it is easier for the blood to flow through it. Characteristics of arterial system. Now, we have millions of veins in our body, millions now. That's how come that, we really don't care if we whip one off, we don't care. Like nurses starting IV, if this one here infiltrates, they leave it alone and get another one. That one messes up, they get another one. But you can't do that to an artery. Every artery feeds something. If you mess that artery up, something's gonna die. Something is gonna die. Okay? But in the arterial system, the pressure is high. Approximately 300 millimeters of mercury. That's the amount of pressure in there. High pressure, that's how come if you're doing your blood gases, once you stick into your artery, you're gonna know right away, right? Because you're gonna see that pulsatile flashback of blood. The blood inside the artery is great, the pressure inside the artery is greater than the pressure inside the syringe. It goes like that. So there's high pressure inside the arterial system. But there is low volume. Over 80% of the blood volume is in the venous system. 8%. If you want to give somebody IV, do you put it in the artery? No. We put it in the vein. We put it inside the vein. So over 80% of the body's volume is inside the venous system. The artery doesn't have much. The artery has a smaller diameter than a vein. Now, a vein can distend, okay, distensible, very distensible for the vein, but it's not very distensible inside the artery. That's how come you can put all the volume that you want inside the vein, nothing happens. So, but inside the arterial system, because of the diameter, and it's not very distensible, you have high resistance. There's high resistance inside the arterial system. Permeability. Okay, now, the capillaries are permeable to certain substances. Permeable just means that it will allow certain things to go through it and not allow certain things to go through it. Okay? The capillary will be permeable to water. Water can go through it. Sugar can go through it. Electrolytes can go through it. Respiratory gases can go through it, and other byproducts. Okay, but I want you to know these two pressures here. Okay? There's a pressure called hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure. Now, hydrostatic pressure is the amount of pressure inside a given space or vessel. Like now, if you take a cup of water, like what me and God, you pour water in there, that water is creating hydrostatic pressure. It's the pressure created by fluid inside a container, any kind of container or vessel. In the body, that pressure is about 10 to 15, okay? 10 to 15 milliliters of mercury. And that pressure tends to force fluid from the vascular space inside the vessel out into the interstitial space. Like this is the vessel here, so we have blood, so there is hydrostatic pressure in here. It will take to force the fluid out to the interstitial space around the inside the lungs. Okay? And then we have because we have to have an opposing pressure. Because if you don't have an opposing pressure, then everything in here is going to leave. Okay, we have another pressure that acts that way. And that is called the oncotic pressure, or the colloid pressure. Okay? So, that one is about 25 to 30. Okay? It is an osmotic pressure. Okay? Blood protein tends to keep fluid in the capillaries, so it's going that way. So, that means now if you have normal hydrostatic pressure, you have normal oncotic pressure, this is not going anywhere. It stays in there. Now, think about edema, kidney edema. You know what? You remember edema, right? Swelling. When somebody has CHF, okay, fluid will back up into the venous system. It's because those two pressures are not equal. The fluid will back up into the venous system. So, as long as those two pressures are equal, You have no edema. Here is the venous system here. It is thinner and more distensible than the ovary. There's low pressure inside the venous system. Again, if you're doing a blood gas, you go inside the vein, you're gonna know. You don't have that positive flashback of blood. You have high volume. You can put any volume you want in the venous system and you'll be fine, but you can't do that in the ovary. There is low resistance in the venous system because it is more distensible. The more fluid you put in it, the more it does that, like that. Okay? So you don't have resistance as much in there. All right, so now let's look at this guy here. This guy is actually two of them. Okay, Frank and Stalling. Mr. Frank and Stalling. Law of the heart. Okay. Now, before I tell you what they're saying, let's remember the definition for preload. Now, preload is the amount of volume or pressure inside the ventricle prior to systole. Now, systole is contraction. The amount of volume or pressure inside the ventricle prior to systole. So that means now at the end of diastole, how much volume do you have inside the chamber? That's all it means. How much volume did your chamber fill up with at the end of diastole? That's preload. We can increase preload. If we want to increase preload, we'll give them intravascular volume. If we want to decrease preload, we'll diurese the patient. Meaning that you want to increase volume, you want to decrease volume. Okay? Now, I want to relate that to cardiac output. Because the more volume that fills the chambers, the more volume that will be pumped out, and then the higher your cardiac output and blood pressure. So that means then that the higher the preload, the higher the cardiac output, the higher the blood pressure. The lower the preload, the lower the cardiac output, the lower the blood pressure. So now, somebody is dehydrated, they have arrived at the hospital, we're going to give them intravascular volume. We increase preload, their blood pressure will go up as well as their cardiac output. Okay, so we have another term there called the afterload. Afterload. The word afterload means resistance, period. It just means resistance. That's what afterload means. So now, afterload is the amount of resistance that the ventricle has to work against in order to eject blood out. Let me draw my heart here. The amount of resistance that the ventricle has to work against in order to eject blood out. So that's my heart, 4 chambers. So now here's the right ventricle, here's the pulmonary artery, and here is the left ventricle, and here is the aorta. So now, look at this now. The right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary artery. Well, the amount of blood that it can pump out would depend on the amount of resistance that it's going to meet when it tries to do that. For instance, I have a tumor here. Wouldn't it be harder for this guy to pump blood through here? Yeah, because it's a resistance, increasing resistance. Well, if for some reason the diameter of the pulmonary artery is like this instead of like that, it will be harder. And that can happen as a result of hypoxemia too. Because if you don't have an adequate oxygen, your pulmonary vasculature will constrict. So resistance goes up. The majority of the afterload on the right side is contributed by the pulmonary artery, the nature of the pulmonary artery. If the pulmonary artery is okay, not constricted, well, the right heart is happy, it's like that. But if something goes wrong here, it's constricted, or maybe there is tumor or secretions or whatever, it makes it harder for the right heart to work. And then the right heart will begin to stress itself. You know, as the right heart stresses itself, the muscle builds bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like somebody working out like that. You build your muscle. After a while, because your muscle has gotten bigger now, it takes up the space in there. When the blood comes, it doesn't fill up really well because the muscle is taking the space. Then you have called pulmonary. You have right heart failure. Okay? So now, we have what we call the PVR now. PVR is the afterload of the right side of the heart. The afterload of the right side of the heart. So we're going to define that. So pulmonary vascular resistance. Pulmonary vascular resistance is the amount of resistance that the right ventricle must work against to eject blood into the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary vascular resistance is the amount of resistance that the right ventricle will have to work against in order to eject blood into the pulmonary artery. I'll give you the normal value for that. It is 150 to 350 days. We're going to go over that later, but just know that if your resistance is in that range, that's good. It means that the right heart is not stressing. But now, how about if you have resistance that is 500 over 350? That's high resistance. This guy here is going to be working very, very hard. There's a drug that we can give to decrease pulmonary resistance. Now, can you think of one? What kind of drug do you think? We'll talk about it several times. What kind of drug do you give for pulmonary hypertension of the newborn?
Nitric oxide.
Huh?
Nitric oxide.
There you go, thank you, that's it. Nitric oxide is a pulmonary vasodilator. So when the resistance goes up, we want to do something about it, we give them nitric oxide. Oxygen can do it too. Okay? If you get instant COPD, for instance, you know they have chronic hypoxemia, right? Instant COPD, they have chronic hypoxemia. The hypoxemia causes the pulmonary vasculature to constrict. That's how come if you have a patient that has instant COPD, they are always on a couple of liters of oxygen, at least one. So that helps to keep their vessels dilated. COPD and pulmonary hypertension coexist. If you have instant COPD, more than likely you have pulmonary hypertension. That pressure is going to go above 25/10. Okay? Any questions about that?
What is SVR? SVR?
Yeah, we're going to SVR now. So the SVR now stands for systemic vascular resistance. Systemic vascular resistance. It is the afterload of the left side of the heart. the afterload of the left side of the heart. Therefore, it is the amount of resistance that the left ventricle must work against in order to eject blood into the air. The amount of resistance that the left ventricle would have to work against in order to eject blood into the aorta.
Into the aorta?
Right? The amount of resistance that the left ventricle must work against in order to eject blood into the aorta. So, since the aorta is the immediate structure that the blood goes into once it leaves the left ventricle, the resistance on the left side is mainly contributed by the aorta. If something is going on here, let's say they have tumor there or constriction or whatever, there's a disease called, how do they call that? Coarctation. Coarctation of the that's what you're at. You have that constriction here. I think we went over that when we were doing the babies. You have constriction there. That will make it harder. That will make resistance to go up. Or anything else that affects the aorta. Makes it harder. Normal value for systemic vascular resistance. Now remember now the left heart works harder and it pumps blood to everybody else. The longer the airway, the more resistance. So now we have the left ventricle pumping to everybody else. So the resistance is going to be higher. So it's about 800 to 1600 games on the left side. How about if we have high resistance on the left side? If I have 2,000 games, it means I've got resistance here. My cardiac output is going to be low because I have high resistance. If I want to fix that, because this guy will be working very hard, the kind of drug I will give will be a systemic vasodilator, which is like nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin. That will vasodilate. We have a few other ones, but we're going to talk about them when we review our advanced pharmacology. So you give systemic vasodilator. Nitric oxide doesn't work very well in the systemic system, but it works very well in the pulmonary system. Another drug that is good to treat pulmonary vascular resistance will be drugs like Viagra, sildenafil, or Cialis. Okay, now, when you go to the hospital and you have a patient that has end-stage COPD, look at their MAR, medical administration record. Maybe they have Viagra there, okay? It's just because the pressure in their right heart is high. It's not because they love to have sex. Brian is laughing. Well, it's true. Because I don't want you to go there and go, oh my God, he's taking Viagra all the time. He must be sleeping a lot with somebody. All right, let's move on here. So yeah, what this guy is saying is that Frankenstein law of the heart is the higher the preload, the higher the cardiac output. The lower the preload, the lower the cardiac output. The higher the afterload, the lower the cardiac output. The lower the afterload, the higher the cardiac output. That's what they're saying. The higher the preload, the higher the cardiac output. The lower the preload, the lower the cardiac output. The higher the afterload, which is resistance, the lower the cardiac output. And the lower the afterload, the higher the cardiac output. So that's Franklin's law of the heart. That's my question next. Myocardial infarction, heart attack. Now, you know that in cardiovascular medicine, time is muscle. That's how come when somebody is having heart attack, we have to do everything to prevent them from getting to that last stage. You know, that's one thing I thank God all the time, because if you're going to have heart attack, you have some sign. You have signs. The first sign is ischemia. Okay, you're going to have embodied T waves. That's the heart warning you. Say, well, look, I don't have enough oxygen. Well, if you ignore that, well, you're going to go to elevated ST segment, which is myocardial injury. Now, that is still the heart warning you that I don't have enough oxygen. And then if you ignore it, then it goes to that last phase, which is infarction, dead muscle tissue, scar tissue. And once you get there, you will never get it back. Once you get to that last stage, you will never get it back. And from that point moving forward, your cardiac function will begin to deteriorate. So my question to you is, if you have had heart attack, would you have higher cardiac output or lower cardiac output?
Lower.
Low, because you messed up the fibers. The contractility is weak now. You can't move a lot of volume. Okay? So that's the next thing here. Contractility. The muscles have to be able to contract before you can have enough contractile force to move the blood out. The higher the contractility, the higher the cardiac output. The lower the contractility or contractile force, the lower the cardiac output. We have heart rate now, 60 to 100 beats per minute. The higher the heart rate, the higher the cardiac output. The lower the heart rate, the lower the cardiac output. We have what we call the ejection fraction. Ejection fraction. Ejection fraction is the percentage of blood that is pumped out from the ventricle in 1 beat. The percentage now, okay? The volume of blood that is pumped out from the heart or the ventricle in 1 beat is stroke volume, the percentage of the volume of blood pumped out. So this is the way it works. This is ejection fraction. Now let's say that at the end of diastole, the left ventricle filled up with 100 milliliter of blood. At the end of diastole, that's my preload. But when it pumps out the blood, it only pumps out 25 milliliter out of the 100 milliliter that it got filled up with. Your ejection fraction is 25%. It pumped out only 25% of the 100 it got filled up with. If it pumps out 50 milliliter, the ejection fraction is 50%. If it pumps out 75 out of the 100, your ejection fraction is 75%. Normal ejection fraction is never 100%. Because if it is 100%, it means that every drop of blood here will be moved down. That's not possible. We have to have something there left to build the bottom number. Normal ejection fraction is 64 to 75%. 64 to 75%. If you can pump out from the ventricle 64 to 75% of what it got filled up with, then that's fine. That's normal heart function. So again, if somebody has had myocardial infarction, heart attack, do you think their ejection fraction will be high or low? It will be low, very good, it will be low. You're not going to be able to pump out most of the volume that fills the ventricle. So here's the formula here. Let's do the 25 milliliters. So if you want to calculate that out, you go like end diastolic volume, the amount of blood inside the chamber at the end of diastole as 100 milliliter minus end systolic volume. Okay, end systolic volume is the amount of volume left in the chamber, okay, after systole. Okay, so which means if I pumped out 25 milliliter, I would have 75 left in there. Right? Are you following me? Yeah. So right there, divided by end diastolic volume, which is 100. So if you work that out, you have 25 divided by 100, and that's 25%. That's the way you work it out. I hope nobody will have ejection fraction of 25%. You know? Yeah. The normal 64 to 75%. Blood flow around the heart. You gotta know, to understand hemodynamics, you have to know how the blood flows around the heart. Okay? I've given you the numbers earlier, so I'm just going to, this is the pressure inside the left ventricle, right here, during contraction. Okay? The blood is pumped out here. So as the blood is going through the different structures, it goes through the capillary, the pressure will begin to decrease. Now, if we calculated the mean arterial pressure, okay, you know how we do it, you know, by the systolic plus 2 times diastolic divided by 3. If we did that, we'll get a number between 90 to 93. Okay, so once the blood pumps out here, immediately we'll calculate the mean arterial pressure. And the blood will keep on flowing there. Okay, so as you go through the different structure of the heart, the pressure will begin to decrease. Okay? So again, it says that mean arterial pressure decreases to 30 as it enters the capillaries. Before it enters the capillaries, it will decrease from 90 or 93 to 30. Okay? The pressure reduces to 20 millimeters of mercury in the capillary. That's your capillary pressure. You all remember the cuff pressure? The cuff pressure, right? What's normal cuff pressure on the ET tube when you intubate somebody? 20 to 25 millimeters of mercury, right? So that's why we don't want to exceed 20, basically, because you are going to compress the capillaries, and then when there's no blood flow through there, you're going to have necrosis in the area where the cuff is pressing on your neck, in your neck. So that's your capillary pressure there, 20. The pressure reduces to 10 as the blood enters the systemic veins. Okay? They're coming around that way, okay? The systemic venous blood flow, the systemic venous blood flow back to the right heart with a pressure of 2 to 6. Here's your CVP now. Okay, 2 to 6, that's what we need in here, okay? Now you see that the pressure here, the 10 is greater than the 2 to 6, so the blood naturally will come down and go that way. Now, if mechanical ventilation increases this number here to, let's say, to 10, so you have pressure, blood, the pressure returning from here is 10, and then what is in here is already 10. Basically, blood cannot flow back. Okay, because it's like blood going up the hill. Once in the right atrium, that's what I should say, blood passes through the tricuspid valve, okay, into the right ventricle. The pressure in the right atrium is 2 to 6. We went over there. And then now we'll go into the right ventricle, which is right here. The right ventricle begin to contract, which is one of the blood pressures, 25/0. Okay? And then after contraction, it will eject the blood out to the pulmonary system. Then you have a bottom number because you're going to have some blood left in here, 25/10. And then blood then goes through the lungs right here. Okay, capillary is 8 to 10, and then into the pulmonary vein, it's coming back. The blood then moves into the left atrium, where the pressure is 2 to 6. Okay. From the left atrium, blood passes through the mitral valve into the left ventricle again. So let me do that very quickly. So we are starting from here. So blood is going to go from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve. By the way, this will be your first quiz. That's, your first quiz, you're going to know the direction of blood flow around the heart, plus you have to know the normal value for the pressures. That's your first quiz, period. So blood goes from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. It goes through the right ventricle, it goes through the pulmonic valve or pulmonary valve into the pulmonary artery, and then it goes to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Okay. Comes back through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, and then it goes through the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, and then it goes to the aortic valve into the aorta. And then it goes all over the body, and then the body will use up the oxygenated, the oxygen in the blood, and then it comes back, back to the inferior and superior vena cava, and back into the right atrium. You have to know how to do that. So you studied that. The first quiz, how blood flows around the heart, plus the normal values for the pressures that we know. Okay, so now CVP, again, to summarize, 2 to 6 or 4 to 12 centimeter cube. Okay? Right ventricular pressure, which is one of the blood pressures, 25/0. When the right ventricle is contracting, that's the amount of pressure in there. After contraction, the valve opens up, the pulmonary valve. Then you have 25/10. That's the pulmonary blood pressure. And then the normal pressure on the left side, weight pressure is 4 to 12. And then you have 120/0 in time. Now remember, we have 2 clinical simulations to go over, so don't get all happy, okay? 120/0 when the left ventricle is contracting. And then we have the systemic blood pressure, 120/80. So the 4 blood pressures, 25/0, 25/10, 120/0, and 120/80. Those are the 4 blood pressures in the heart. Name 4 chambers of the heart. We can do that. 4 chambers of the heart. We have the right atrium, we have the right ventricle, we have the left atrium, and we have the left ventricle. Name 4 valves in the heart. Well, we have the bicuspid valve, we have the bicuspid valve, we have the pulmonic valve, we have the aortic valve. How does preload, have, what am I saying here? How does affect cardiac output? How does preload affect cardiac output? Well, the higher the preload, the higher the cardiac output. The lower the preload, the lower the cardiac output. What is ejection fraction and how does it relate to cardiac output? Well, ejection fraction is the percentage of the volume of the blood in the ventricle that is pumped out. Okay. The higher the ejection fraction, the higher the cardiac output. The lower the ejection fraction, the lower the cardiac output. Name 2 phases of the cardiac cycle. That's systole, which is the contractile phase of the heart, and diastole, which is the relaxation phase of the heart. What is afterload? Afterload is resistance. The amount of resistance that the ventricle must work against in order to eject the blood out. Well, you have 2 of them. You have PVR, pulmonary vascular resistance, on the right side, which is the amount of resistance that the right ventricle must work against in order to eject blood into the pulmonary artery. And then we have the left one, SVR, systemic vascular resistance, the amount of resistance that the left ventricle must work against in order to inject blood into the aorta. Any questions about that? Yeah, the clinical simulations will not take us too long. We're gonna do this because we're behind here. We're not just gonna do 2.